The Ozark Mountains of the 1840s were a place where a man could disappear forever, and nobody outside a handful of settlers would ever know. Endless forests covered the hills like a dark ocean of trees, broken only by narrow rivers, rocky bluffs, and scattered settlements struggling to survive on the edge of civilization. In those days there were no telephones, no organized search teams, and very little law. If someone vanished in the wilderness, people usually assumed nature had claimed another victim. Bears, wolves, flash floods, disease, accidents, and simple bad luck were common realities of frontier life. Yet among the settlers who lived deep in the Ozarks, there was one story that endured longer than any other, a story about a trapper whose cruelty became so infamous that later generations would question whether he had ever existed at all. His name was Elias Crow. Nobody knew where Crow came from. He appeared one autumn without warning, arriving in a small settlement with a wagon full of animal pelts and enough money to purchase supplies for an entire winter. He claimed to be a trapper looking for land far from other people. The settlers welcomed him because skilled hunters were valuable on the frontier. Crow seemed ordinary enough at first. He was tall, thin, and unusually quiet. His face looked older than his years, weathered by hardship and marked by a long scar stretching from his jaw to his neck. He rarely smiled. He rarely laughed. He rarely participated in conversations. Whenever someone asked about his past, he offered vague answers and quickly changed the subject. After purchasing supplies, he disappeared into the mountains. Months later he returned with more furs than anyone had ever seen from a single trapper. The quality of the pelts was exceptional. Beaver, fox, otter, and wolf skins filled his wagon. Traders eagerly paid high prices, and Crow quickly earned a reputation as one of the most successful trappers in the Ozarks. Still, something about him unsettled people. He never discussed where he trapped. He never allowed anyone to accompany him. He never invited anyone to his cabin. Other mountain men often worked together or exchanged information about hunting grounds, but Crow remained isolated. It was as though he wanted to erase every trace of his existence whenever he disappeared into the wilderness. For several years life continued this way. Crow appeared in town, sold his furs, purchased supplies, and vanished back into the mountains. Most settlers paid little attention to him. Frontier life was difficult enough without worrying about an eccentric trapper. Then the disappearances began. At first nobody connected them to Crow. A traveler failed to arrive at his destination. A hunter wandered into the woods and never returned. A trapper from another region vanished while exploring unfamiliar territory. Such incidents were tragic, but not unusual. The Ozarks were vast and unforgiving. Yet as the years passed, the number of disappearances slowly increased. Entire campsites were discovered abandoned. Horses returned without riders. Canoes drifted downstream with no sign of their owners. Families waiting for loved ones received nothing except silence. The strange part was that many of the missing people had last been seen traveling through the same general region of the mountains, an isolated area where few settlers dared to venture. Rumors began spreading. Some claimed a gang of outlaws was hiding in the wilderness. Others believed hostile spirits haunted the forest. A few older residents whispered about ancient curses connected to forgotten burial grounds. Nobody knew the truth. Then one winter, a merchant named Caleb Turner disappeared while transporting supplies between settlements. Turner was experienced, careful, and familiar with the region. When he failed to arrive, several men organized a search party. Days later they discovered his wagon near a narrow trail. The horses were gone, but the cargo remained untouched. There were no signs of robbery. No signs of struggle. No blood. No body. It looked as though Turner had simply stepped away and vanished. While examining the area, one of the searchers noticed unusual tracks leading into the woods. They followed the trail for nearly a mile before finding a series of deep impressions in the earth unlike anything they had seen before. The marks resembled enormous trap jaws pressed into the soil. The men became uneasy and decided to return before darkness fell. Their discovery fueled local fears. More stories emerged. A hunter claimed he had seen someone watching him from a distant ridge. A pair of travelers reported hearing screams echo through the forest after sunset. Another settler swore he found strange wooden symbols carved into trees near a remote valley. Despite growing concern, nobody could identify a culprit. Meanwhile, Elias Crow continued his routine, as though nothing unusual was happening. If anything, he seemed more prosperous than ever. His furs remained plentiful. His supplies were always paid for in cash. During years when other trappers struggled, Crow somehow thrived. People noticed but kept their suspicions to themselves. Accusing a man of murder without evidence was dangerous, especially in a place where help was days away. Everything changed when an old trader named Samuel Pike stumbled upon Crow's hidden valley. Pike had spent decades traveling through the Ozarks and considered himself impossible to lose. One rainy afternoon, he became disoriented while following a game trail and wandered into unfamiliar territory. As evening approached, he noticed smoke rising between distant trees. Believing he had found another trapper's camp, he moved closer. What he discovered would haunt him for the rest of his life. Hidden within a narrow valley stood a cabin surrounded by dozens of traps. Some were ordinary animal traps, but others were far larger than anything Pike had ever seen. Rusted iron jaws lined pathways through the woods. Heavy chains hung from trees. Wooden stakes formed crude barriers around the property. Strange carvings covered fence posts and cabin walls. Animal skulls dangled from ropes, swaying gently in the wind. The entire place felt wrong. Pike immediately recognized the cabin as Crow's. Before he could leave, movement caught his eye. Standing near the edge of the clearing was Elias Crow. He was completely motionless. He simply stared. Pike later claimed that Crow's expression contained no surprise, no anger, and no curiosity. It was the look of a man who had expected visitors all along. Terrified, Pike turned his horse around and rode away as fast as possible. That night he reached a settlement and shared what he had seen. His story spread rapidly. For the first time, people openly discussed the possibility that Crow might be responsible for the disappearances. Yet suspicion was not proof. Nobody was willing to march into the mountains and confront a heavily armed trapper based on rumors alone. Months passed. Then another man vanished. His name was Thomas Reed, a young surveyor hired to map portions of the Ozarks for future settlement. Reed was intelligent, cautious, and meticulous. He documented everything in detailed journals. When he failed to return from an expedition, a search party was organized almost immediately. They followed his route for days before discovering his abandoned campsite. Most of his belongings remained untouched. Nearby they found his journal. The final pages contained increasingly unsettling entries. Reed described hearing footsteps around his camp at night. He mentioned finding enormous traps hidden beneath leaves. He wrote about seeing smoke rising from a valley that did not appear on any map. Then came the final entry, written in shaky handwriting. It read, "I found the valley. There are traps everywhere. Someone is watching me from the trees. I think he knows I'm here." Thomas Reed was never seen again. Fear swept through the settlements. Families stopped traveling after dark. Hunters avoided the western ridges. Children were warned never to wander into the mountains alone. Even hardened frontiersmen admitted feeling uneasy whenever Crow entered town. Yet the trapper behaved exactly as he always had. He sold furs, bought supplies, spoke little, left before sunset. The silence surrounding him became more frightening.
The discovery of the skeletons changed everything. For years, the settlers of the Ozarks had explained away the disappearances as unfortunate accidents, blaming the wilderness for tragedies that now seemed far too frequent to be coincidence. But the moment human remains were pulled from the ground near the hidden valley, fear transformed into certainty. Someone had been hunting people. Someone had been hiding bodies. And every trail led back to the same man, Elias Crow. Within days, the story spread across the region. Farmers abandoned fields early to return home before dark. Hunters refused to travel alone. Travelers altered their routes to avoid the western ridges entirely. Parents warned their children never to wander beyond sight of the settlement. Even the toughest frontiersmen admitted they felt uneasy whenever they thought about Crow's isolated cabin hidden somewhere in the mountains. Yet despite growing fear, nobody immediately organized a direct confrontation. The Ozarks were dangerous enough without charging blindly into the territory of a man suspected of murdering countless people. Crow was known as an expert woodsman. He knew every stream, every trail, every hidden path through the wilderness. If he truly was responsible, then approaching him carelessly could be a death sentence. Instead, a group of experienced settlers decided to gather more evidence. They formed small scouting parties and began exploring the region surrounding Crow's Valley. What they found only deepened the nightmare. The first discovery was a network of hidden trails. These paths were nearly invisible unless someone knew exactly what to look for. Branches had been carefully arranged to conceal them. Fallen leaves disguised footprints. Certain trees bore small carved markings that appeared to serve as navigation symbols. Whoever created the trails had spent years perfecting them. Following one path led to an abandoned campsite. Another ended at a concealed overlook that provided a clear view of a river crossing used by travelers. A third connected directly to an old trading route. It became obvious that Crow had not simply been trapping animals. He had been watching people, studying them, tracking their movements, learning their habits. Then came the traps. At first, the searchers found ordinary steel traps designed for wolves and foxes. But deeper in the wilderness, they encountered something far more disturbing. Hidden beneath leaves and brush were massive custom-built traps unlike anything most had ever seen. Some were attached to heavy chains anchored to trees. Others were connected to elaborate mechanisms that could be triggered from a distance. One trap was large enough to snap shut around a human leg. Another appeared designed specifically to prevent escape once activated. The men examining them exchanged nervous glances. These devices had not been created for animals. They had been created for people. Several members of the search party wanted to turn back immediately. Others argued that they had come too far to stop now. Fear and determination pushed them onward. As they ventured deeper into the mountains, the forest itself seemed to change. Birds became scarce. Animal tracks nearly vanished. Even the wind seemed strangely absent. Many later described an overwhelming feeling that they were being watched. Every snapped twig sounded like a warning. Every movement among the trees triggered alarm. It was as though the wilderness knew something terrible existed within it. 3 days into the search, they discovered a small wooden structure hidden among dense brush. From a distance, it resembled a storage shed. Upon closer inspection, they realized it had no windows. The heavy door was reinforced with iron. Deep scratches covered the interior walls. Rusted chains hung from wooden beams. The searchers stood silently, unable to ignore the horrifying possibility of what the structure had been used for. Nobody spoke for several minutes. One man eventually muttered that it looked more like a prison than a shed. No one disagreed. The discovery convinced them that Crow was far more dangerous than they had imagined. Yet even then, they had not reached the worst part of the valley. The following morning, they finally located the cabin itself. Hidden within a narrow clearing surrounded by steep hills, it looked almost ordinary at first glance. Smoke drifted from a stone chimney. Firewood was stacked neatly beside the porch. Animal pelts hung drying from wooden racks. But the closer they approached, the more disturbing details emerged. Strange carvings covered the cabin walls. Dozens of skulls decorated fence posts surrounding the property. Some belonged to animals. Others were so damaged that identification was difficult. Wind chimes made from bones rattled softly in a breeze. Every part of the place seemed designed to intimidate anyone who ventured too close. The cabin appeared empty. Crow was nowhere in sight. After a tense discussion, the settlers decided to enter. The front door creaked open slowly. Inside, they found a surprisingly organized interior. Shelves contained supplies carefully arranged by size and type. Trapping equipment hung neatly from walls. Maps covered an entire section of the cabin. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Then, one of the men noticed markings on the maps. Small symbols had been placed throughout the region. Some marked river crossings. Others marked campsites. Several symbols corresponded exactly with locations where people had disappeared over the years. A heavy silence filled the room. The implications were impossible to ignore. Crow had been documenting the movements of travelers for years. He had been keeping records, detailed records. The settlers continued searching. Beneath a loose floorboard, they discovered journals. Dozens of journals. Some dated back nearly 15 years. The pages described weather conditions, trapping routes, and observations about wildlife. But mixed among those entries were notes about people. Names, descriptions, travel schedules, habits, weaknesses. One entry described a merchant who traveled alone every month. Another detailed a route used by hunters during deer season. Several entries referred to victims using language normally reserved for prey animals. The more they read, the clearer the truth became. Elias Crow viewed human beings the same way other trappers viewed wolves or foxes. They were targets, nothing more. Yet the most horrifying discovery remained hidden in the cabin cellar. A trapdoor concealed beneath a rug led underground. Carrying lanterns, the settlers descended carefully. The cellar was larger than expected. Wooden shelves lined the walls. Crates filled one corner. Then someone raised a lantern toward the far end of the room. What emerged from the darkness froze everyone in place. Hanging from beams were personal belongings collected over many years. Hats, boots, coats, jewelry, watches, knives, bags, dozens upon dozens of items. Some are weathered with age. Others appeared relatively recent. Every object had belonged to someone who had vanished. It was a collection of trophies, evidence of crimes stretching back years. One settler reportedly collapsed after recognizing a jacket worn by his missing brother. Another identified a silver pocket watch belonging to a friend who disappeared long ago. The realization was devastating. Many of the missing had never left the mountains. They had ended their journeys here. Inside this cabin, inside this valley, news of the discoveries spread rapidly. Additional volunteers arrived from nearby settlements. Armed posses formed almost overnight. This was no longer a search for answers. It had become a hunt for Elias Crow himself. Yet Crow seemed to have vanished. Days passed without any sign of him. Search parties combed the mountains. Trails were monitored. Camps were established at key crossings. Still nothing. Some began to wonder whether Crow had fled the region entirely. Others feared he remained nearby, silently observing every move they made. The uncertainty created constant tension. Then the attacks began. One evening, a lookout failed to return to camp. Searchers found blood on a trail, but no body. 2 nights later, a horse was discovered wandering without its rider. The following week, another scout vanished while patrolling alone. Panic spread through the posses. Crow was still there. He was striking from the shadows. He knew the terrain better than anyone. Every attempt to capture him seemed to end in failure. The hunter had become the hunted. As weeks passed, frustration turned into obsession. More men joined the search. Rewards were offered. Rumors exploded across the Ozarks. Some claimed Crow moved through the forest like a ghost. Others insisted he possessed supernatural abilities. Stories grew more extreme with each retelling. Yet one fact remained undeniable. Nobody could catch him. Then, during an unusually cold November evening, a breakthrough finally came. a scouting party discovered fresh tracks leading away from an abandoned camp. The tracks matched Crow's distinctive boots. For the first